idea that courage is contagious, and you use the examples of the Spartans. When a Spartan, funnily enough, did my dissertation on Sparta and the question of whether Sparta was an empire. So Athens, of course, was an empire, the Athenian empire. But
they became an empire when they beat Athens, right? And that was sort of that was also their undoing. I would love to hear about this.
When the Spartans were asked by neighboring or foreign states or city-states or whatever you would call them for military assistance, they wouldn't send loads of Spartan soldiers. In fact, I don't think there were that many Spartan soldiers. They'd send one dude. They'd send one general or leader. And the reason for this is, as you say, because courage is contagious. And I think we should just use that as a jumping off point as well about leadership.
Yes.
Because courage and leadership kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, there's also a great story that I have in the book about, it's a famous story about the Texas Rangers. There's a riot in Galveston or Dallas or something, and they send desperately for the Texas Rangers. And one Texas Ranger shows up and they go, "There's only one Texas Ranger?" And he goes, "There's only one riot, right?" And so the idea that one leader is enough to sort of shore things up, to get things going, to sort of point people in the right direction. Certainly that's the case of de Gaulle. Certainly that's the case of the 300 Spartans. They sort of make this one effort, which reassures and sort of binds Greece together. But I think we've seen this in COVID, right? The difference between good leadership and bad leadership, good communication, bad communication, fear-mongering versus honesty, straightforwardness. This is an enormous, these are vastly different approaches, and ultimately the distinction is, the outcome is played out, in terms of the scale of the tragedy that ensues.
An important part of this is the significance of being yourself.
Well, that's the scariest thing.
That sounds like an inane thing to say, but it's crucial in your view.
I mean, the scariest thing is to be different, right? The scariest thing is to be your unique self. All of us have utterly unique DNA. We're the only person like us that has ever been born in all of human history. And the first thing we do is throw that away to be more like other people. It's one of the terrible tragedies of the human collective species.
So how do we be more ourselves?
I mean, this goes to confidence, but I think also just the idea that it's a competitive advantage, right? Do you want to be trying to be like everyone else, or do you want to do the thing that only you can do? So it's scary, but it's also in your self-interest, I would argue.
And just quickly to go back to this idea of habit. I mean, your point is to use our nervous system or our neural pathways as our ally in moments
to get used to it,
rather than our enemy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to get used to it. And so if reflexively you defer, that you just go along with what other people are saying, you don't speak up, you put aside what you like and pretend that you like this or that, or that you act like this or that because that's how everyone does it or your peers do it. The idea that then you're suddenly bravely going to throw that all aside when something important happens is extremely unlikely.
I wonder how much of this is also about not over-attaching ourselves to particular things, not over-attaching ourselves to material things, to identity, to followers, to fans, to status and all that. Because if we are able to stand freer of that stuff, then when we are called upon to be courageous, perhaps we're less fearful of losing things.
I think that's right. The more attached you are to your stuff, the less likely you are going to be to do anything that potentially, however slightly, risks that same stuff. If your car is really important to you, if the title is really important to you, if being a member of this club or this peer group is really important to you, how are you going to speak up when that group does something wrong? I think about my time in American Apparel. It's two things. One, I liked being an important person at a provocative company. And two, salary is addictive, right? The idea of not knowing where the rent is coming from is not a pleasant thought. And both of those things held me back from doing what I obviously knew was the right thing to do.
We've talked a little bit about silence already. Now, I think you said that silence can be violence.
Yeah.
Let's address violence head on, because it is part of the book. Violence can be courageous. I think you quote Gandhi as saying that there is a line that one crosses, and he was famously non-violent. But then also sometimes it's right not to fight. It can be better not to fight. So just give us those two examples or ideas and flesh them out for us.
A friend of mine is a martial arts, like self-defense expert. And he has this great line. And he says, violence is rarely the answer, but when it is the answer, it's the only answer. And yes, sometimes there is no way out but through. And that's where the military comes in. That's where, sort of, a moment of heroism or training needs to kick in. I mean, it'd be wonderful if life didn't have those moments, but, invariably it does. At the same time, any fight that can be avoided should be avoided. And provided that it does not force one to compromise on the things that really matter. So the courage to know when to walk away and when to jump into the fray is it's tricky business.
Tell us about going beyond, going over and above.
Well, so, we've been talking about fear, we've been talking about courage. You mentioned the Spartans. The third part of the book is like the distinction between courage and heroism. So there's a selfishness to courage, right? The decision to, talking about Jeff Bezos, right? It's courageous to bet the company every day. It's not exactly heroic, right? And so I'm interested in the people who are willing to give everything, to go beyond, to not just risk themselves, but to give themselves for something they believe in, for someone else, perhaps for someone they don't even know. And there is a sense, I think, that this is the highest plane that we can reach as human beings.
Give us some examples.
I talk about the 300 Spartans, of course. You talk about someone like Martin Luther King. I mean, Martin Luther King could have headed up to New York and lived as an activist and a writer and a speaker and never stepped foot in the South again. But he went repeatedly back, he said, into the Valley, knowing that he'd be arrested, knowing that he'd be beaten, knowing that he could be kidnapped, knowing, I think, in the end, eventually that he would be killed. But he never turned away from that. You look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, those 12 American service members who had to go out every day into crowds of people, many of whom they knew would have done anything to hurt them, to evacuate thousands, perhaps a more impressive in terms of scale evacuation than Dunkirk. And, they went out into those crowds every single day and, eventually paid the ultimate price so that those planes could be packed full with people. And that kind of heroism is, I think, it's most impressive because they didn't get anything out of it.
And this is very interesting. I mean, if you look at the example of the 300, and I'll get the name wrong, but I think it was the Battle of Thermopylae, and I was brought up by my dad with that story as an example of outrageous, outstanding courage, something that we might aspire to. And you look at these American soldiers. Now, those Spartans and these American soldiers, there's an overlap, it seems to me, between incredible individual courage going beyond, perhaps, and we see examples of that in warfare. That's how we have things in the UK like the Victorian Cross or the Military Cross. One of my grandfathers won the Military Cross. But there's also training. Those Spartans would be, I mean, from the very, very young age, I can't remember whether Spartans were bathed in wine or whatever it was, but I mean, these hardened beings right from the get-go. These American soldiers, as well as being individually brave, would have been conditioned to be incredibly brave. So this is a little bit of the individual heroics here, but also this conditioning that you've talked about making bravery a habit.
Yeah, you're really, as they say, brave for the person next to you more than you are for the country itself. Although my friend Stephen Pressfield, who wrote an amazing book called Gates of Fire, a novel about the Battle of Thermopylae, he brought something up to me during the pandemic that I've thought a lot about since. He was saying that for the Spartans, if you lost your sword in battle or your spear broke in battle, they would give you a new one. It was fine. But if you lost your shield in battle, you were excommunicated, even executed, because your shield, your sword or your spear was an offensive weapon, right? It was for you. But your shield, the way the Spartan line worked, everyone stood up with their shields, which protected the person in front of them or next to them. So if everyone held up their shield, there was an impenetrable line of protection. So to drop your shield was to not just, drop a piece of property, but was to endanger the person next to you. And he said that this was a great metaphor to think about during COVID, whether you're talking about vaccination or you're talking about masks or you're talking about social distancing, that it's not just the training, but it's also the sense of obligation to everyone else. And that if everyone does their obligation at the same time, we're all safe. But if one person falters, it endangers everyone. And I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. And so I think that's both training, but it's also about culture. It's about a sense that binds a group or a people together like that.
You just dropped out very momentarily there, but it's interesting because in a way, the sort of flip side of this is, so if one person doesn't get it right, if they step outside of their training in a negative way, that endangers the whole. Equally, if you're on an airplane that's being hijacked and no one does anything, that plane will go down. Yes. But if lots of people step up, then you have a far greater chance of collective survival.
I think that's very well said, especially on the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Just briefly, because we've got questions to answer from the audience. It's fascinating. We can go on forever. Seneca turns up quite a bit in the book. Tell us why you're fascinated by Seneca.
Well, Seneca is such a great example of a courageous philosopher, a lover of virtue, who ends up in Nero's court. And he probably tells himself he's the adult in the room, but where does this sort of courageous service also become complicity? And the tension there, I think, provides a lot of lessons in the modern day. Again, it's the idea of like, sure, he could have fallen on his sword and maybe someone worse would have replaced him. But also by not doing anything, he allowed an untenable regime the veneer of legitimacy. And I remain fascinated by that moral complexity and lack of clarity.
And let's not leave the Spartans entirely behind, because they used a very important, tiny but powerful word, if.
Yes. Yeah,
so
they were told.
The father of Alexander the Great. Was he King Philip, was he?
Yes, they were told, hey, if I make it through these walls, I'm going to slaughter every single one of you. And they just said, yeah, if. And I think that's one of the great retorts of all time.
Let's take some questions. Jack says, what do you tell yourself when you feel the fear of taking a leap in the dark?
Often that fear is probably a sign that I'm heading in the right direction, right? If you feel no fear about it, it's probably easy, probably not pushing the boundaries much. It's not a perfect rule, but I do tend to go like, it's good that it's scary. It means there's something here.
I think it's probably important to say here that, as I understand it, I don't think you're encouraging recklessness for the sake of it.
No, and Aristotle says that the opposite of courage is not just cowardice, it's also recklessness. So yeah, there's some middle ground there, to be sure.
James says, would you run for public office?
I guess. I mean, I have no plans to, and I don't think there's any interest from anyone that I should. But if there was the right office at the right time in my life, sure.
How do we avoid this saying, by the way, that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely? How easy is it for a politician to take your blueprint for courage and actually apply it to the reality of political office?
There's a great line from the biographer Robert Caro, who writes about biographer Lyndon Johnson. It goes, it's not that power corrupts. He says, that's too simple. He says, power reveals. And I think that's a better way to think about it. It's not that the person was perfect and then power turned them into something different than what they were. It's that power gave them an opportunity to be who they always were, which was just obscured slightly by their circumstances previous. That's what I find so fascinating about Marcus Aurelius. He does hold absolute power, and it doesn't corrupt him. It makes him better. And so I think the idea that it reveals is the way to think about it. What will it reveal is the question for you.
Okay. Mathilde says, what do you recommend are good behaviors that cultivate courage? And do you find that we are living in more uncourageous times than the past?
I mean, I think there's obviously been moments of cowardice in the past, to be sure. I don't know if we're more or less courageous then, but I think as far as cultivating it, look, I think there's a reason that hard work, hard exercise, training, I think putting yourself in difficult, stressful situations that force you to answer this question, like, who's in charge? Is it that voice in my head, or is it me? Like, is it my body that's in charge, or is it my mind? Who's in charge? I think if you can practice sports, exercises, public speaking, things that force you to get up and out of that comfort zone, it's a great way to cultivate courage.
Yeah, Ellen's asked a very similar question. How can a person practically learn to be more courageous and do those things like helping the neighbor in distress? Charlotte says, just quickly, could you remind us of the 4 cardinal virtues, please?
Yes, courage, temperance, justice, wisdom.
Ellen says, are the Stoics missing a virtue? Wisdom, courage, self-discipline, justice, yes, all good, but where is the love? Should we add kindness? It's a modern virtue which is maybe overlooked by the manly Stoics. No,
I don't think it's overlooked at all. I think this all falls under justice. I think today when we hear justice, we think the justice system, we think whether something is legal or not. But I would say honesty fits under the virtue of justice. I think love, connection, relationships, the common good, happiness. I think it all fits under the virtue of justice and wisdom as well.
I mean, we touched on some of your bravery or your courage, but Carmen, what's the most courageous thing you've ever done?
I don't know. I don't think that. I think that's a trick question. I don't think that's that. I think if you asked a war hero, they'd have trouble answering that question. So I'm definitely going to have trouble answering that question.
You leave it to others. Sarah says, how do you interpret Navalny's courage?
I mean, you want to talk about someone sort of willingly going back down into the valley. I mean, he didn't have to do that, and he did it. And he almost certainly knows how that's going to end, but he's willing to give everything to make the demonstration. And it's interesting also to see Putin, not, I don't want to say walk into the trap, but Putin is also powerless to not give Navalny it's in the same way that the British were powerless to do anything about Gandhi, because he understood the absolute weakness of the moral position, and he hones in on it. It's interesting to see even a sort of an autocrat like Putin not be able to see what's happening and not play into it. I find that fascinating as well.
Final question from Matt. Is there courage in the mundane, for example, in countering negative behaviors and ensuring equality?
Well, just what about the courage to get a little bit better? The courage to ask a dumb question, right? The courage to be kind to someone who's been unkind to you. We talked about the courage to be different. I think there's incredible amounts of courage in the mundane. And, to be a human being, to have hope in a broken, dysfunctional world. These are all mundane bits of ordinary courage that I hope we see more of.
Let's finish, if we may, Ryan, with the story of a slave whose name I forget, but you vividly describe his encounter with his slave owner and his relative triumph.
Frederick Douglass, one of the sort of second founders of modern America, you know, in the middle 19th century. He just decides one day, no, not gonna get beaten anymore. He says, you can kill me, but you're not gonna whip me. And he basically beats the crap out of his slave owner. The guy finds a way to rationalize this to himself, but you know, Frederick Douglass says, you know, from the moment I could no longer be whipped, I was half free. And he runs away a few years later and becomes one of the great American writers and heroes and, you know, public intellectuals, friends with Lincoln, just an utterly great human being. And this comes from, you know, his decision one day to say, no, not with my consent anyway. This is the transformative moment, not just in his life, but for a generation of Americans who are inspired by his example, including myself.
And it fits into something else you say in the book, that if you're forced, then you haven't been courageous, right?
Yeah, Seneca says, if they can force you, you don't know how to die. So you always have a say. You have more of a say than you think you do. Anyway.
Well, it's a really good read, this book. And I love the title because Courage is calling. That these are times, as I suppose there's an argument that every time it requires or is calling for courage. But it feels like now is a moment for courage in all sorts of ways, from how we deal with the climate, how we deal with threats like Trump, populism, racism resurfacing or continuing, and so many other threats as well. Courage is calling, and this is a reminder to all of us who can be trapped in the siren voices of wealth or success or status or followers, that actually there's something really good worth aspiring to out there. And that, as you say, we can all do it day by day. We can train ourselves, we can make it a habit. So thank you for that. Thanks for writing the book. It's a really important read. Thank you for joining us this evening as well. And it's been great to chat to you, Ryan.
It's been awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for attending.
And your book is available. People can get it, I imagine, in hard copy already, because I can see it behind you, but also they can buy it online in hard copy too.
Everywhere books are sold.
Cheers.